today. We are giving our delegates a chance to get onto the call. We've had an exciting almost 300 people sign up for this topic. So we're quite excited that there's so much interest around the topic. As you may know, we host monthly sessions at Trialogue, and this is our first one for this year. And just a few technical notes before we kick off with the content. Firstly, there are a few ways to engage on the call. You're welcome to use the chat function to connect with fellow delegates and to share your thoughts on content. We also encourage you to ask questions through the session. You can do so using the Q&A rather than the chat box. I'll draw questions from the Q&A box for panelists to respond to in the discussion section at the end of this call. So please do direct your questions to one or more of the panelists and try to keep your questions as succinct as possible. There is a short survey which will pop up on your screen at the end of the session. And if you can complete that, we'll also email it to you. It'll give us a good sense of not only your experience of this session, but some topics that you'd like to see covered in future sessions. The session is being recorded, and the notes, the slides, and the recording will be made available to everyone that registered. And you can also tweet along using hashtag CSI webinar and or ESG trends. If we can move to the next slide and just have a quick look at the agenda for this afternoon. I'm Zayan Davids, and it's my absolute privilege to be your moderator this afternoon. Following my very brief overview, I'm going to hand over to our brilliant panelists today. We've got representation from the US, from India, and from South Africa. And we'll round out the discussion with your questions for panelists. But first, to get a sense of who we have on the call today, I'm going to launch our first poll. And if you can tell us what type of organization you represent, it'll be really lovely to hear where the interest is coming from. Unsurprisingly, there's a strong showing from the nonprofit sector. We've got quite a number of large corporates on the call. I'm going to end the poll to share the results with you. And you'll see that mainly nonprofits and big business, and then we've got some representation from SMEs, consultants, academics, and other. Thank you very much all for being here today. If we move on to the next slide, as I mentioned at the top of this, we have seen a great response to the session, and we're very pleased about that. We do see some familiar names on the call, but for those of you who are new to this kind of session with us, welcome. Thank you for being here. And I would love to take a moment to just tell you very briefly about Trialogue. We are one of only a few consultancies that focuses exclusively on responsible business. We do this through our knowledge sharing platforms, all of which aim to make corporate social investments in South Africa more effective. The two main types of consulting that we do are monitoring and evaluation and CSI strategy development. On the knowledge sharing platforms, we run an annual conference, which will take place this year on the 10th and 11th of May. Registration opens next month, and we do hope that you'll join us either virtually or in person. We're doing it hybrid this year, in person in Johannesburg. So please come and have some robust conversation and debate and workshopping with us. We also publish the annual Business and Society Handbook, which we invite you to profile your development work in. And the Trialogue Knowledge Hub is an online body of knowledge that unpacks specific topics in development and is aimed at strengthening the impact of investment in those areas. If we move to the next slide, please. This is Trialogue's definitions framework, which was featured in the 2019 edition of our Business and Society Handbook. I know it's tiny. If you look very closely, you'll see that CSI forms a component of the S, or the social, within environmental, social, and governance. the aspects that constitute responsible business. And you'll also note how interdependent all three of these categories and their subcategories are for realizing truly and holistically responsible business. I do apologize for this wheel being so small. If it's too small for you to decipher, don't worry, we will include it in your summary pack, which we'll email to you after the session. And it'll hopefully help to inform your contextualization of CSI within the broader ESG space. I now want to launch the second poll, which asks, let me just find this. We want to know when you think that ESG will truly be integrated across every department at your organization. And in this case, integration refers to strategy and daily decision making. Just a few more seconds as the votes come in. Thank you. I'm going to share the results. And this is very promising. So 26% during the next year and 51% in the next 2 to 5 years, which is very promising. And then we've got 9% in the next 6 to 10 years, and the balance is unsure. But the longer term, the 11 to 15 and 15 or more years don't have any votes. So here's hoping. I think as the fog slowly begins to lift from this world-altering 2 years that's demanded unparalleled levels of resilience, I'm sure that many of you will agree that we're so relieved that this period seems to have, and as your results on the poll show, it seems to have begun to entrench ESG thinking into organizations. ESG, or environmental, social, and governance issues, have gained profile, and if not support yet, then at least acknowledgement of its importance within organizations across the world. I also just want to, because we've got such a strong nonprofit showing today, for our nonprofit audience, thank you for being here and for recognizing that ESG should not just be designated to the corporate sector alone. You've helped to drive this shift. You've acted as watchdogs, whistleblowers, and advocates. You may also have benefited from ESG-aligned funding from companies, but beyond this, your organizations also have the opportunity to embrace the very policies and practices that you encourage externally. Today, we're going to hear more about how companies in other parts of the world are responding to ESG, with emphasis on the social aspect and how this compares and contrasts to companies at home. If we can move to the next slide. I would now like to invite our first panelist, Beth Gallagher, to turn her camera and mic on. Beth is the Director of Corporate Insights at Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose, or CECP. They're based in the US. CECP convenes the Global Exchange Network, to which Trialogue belongs as the Southern African partner. Beth, welcome and thank you for joining us today. To kick off our conversation, hi Beth, to kick off our conversation, CECP, in collaboration with the CECP Global Exchange that you oversee, released the Global Impact at Scale 2021 edition report last month. Congratulations again. The study highlights international trends in corporate purpose strategies, such as tracking progress on environmental, social, and governance factors, progress on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, response to COVID-19, employee engagement, and more. Please, could you share with us some of the most notable findings from this report, Beth?
Yes, well, first off, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to join the call and share some of the insights that came out of that Global Impact at Scale report that you referred to. But firstly, just wanted to, for those on the call who may not be familiar, Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose shares a pretty similar mission to Trialogue in that we're a trusted advisor to companies. We work with CEOs and leaders in corporate responsibility, sustainability, foundations, investor relations, communications, and really many other functions. And our goal is to share actionable insights through our CEO-led coalition. On the next slide, you can see that we work with a very large network of companies as part of this coalition. Our members are more than 200 of the world's largest companies, and we support them by providing benchmarking and analysis through convenings. Again, similar to Trialogue, we bring people together to work on these issues together. We provide strategy and communication support in the areas of societal and community investment, employee engagement, ESG and sustainable business, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and telling the story. On the next slide, just showcasing the global exchange of which Trialogue is a partner. So this global exchange unites mission-driven corporate societal engagement organizations to advance the corporate sector as a force for good around the world. We have partners in 18 countries and regions, and we really serve companies by building a body of knowledge on locally relevant corporate citizenship best practices. The Global Impact at Scale report is kind of our signature body of work that we undertake together annually. So all these partners work to help develop and then deploy the survey that informs the research, some of the research and analysis that goes into the report. Big thanks to many companies in South Africa that contributed to the survey that was included in the report findings. On the next slide, I'll just review a bit what all is included in the latest report. We were, thrilled to release this right around a month ago at the end of January. So in total, we received completed surveys from 165 companies headquartered in 18 countries and regions. The survey was on their 2020 activity. The report does feature quite a bit of content, so I'll share just a few highlights quickly today. Again, in the report, we share top 10 highlights in ESG and social investments and volunteerism. Those are drawn from the survey findings, as well as trends in ESG management, integration, and reporting. Since the report covers 2020, it of course encompasses companies' COVID-19 responses, as well as employee engagement insights. And the Global Exchange also had a few kind of programmatic and focus areas that they were interested in gaining insight into, such as DEI and workforce. Those are also included in the report. The report also features country highlights from across the exchange around policy and other matters, and some of the work the exchange partners are doing, and case studies from companies. So it is a pretty robust report. And lastly, I'll highlight that the report also includes analyses of the top 3,000 companies globally using ESG data available from Bloomberg. So there's some additional insights on key ESG topics in the report there. And I'll pull out just a few examples as I dive into the report findings. On the next slide, I think I have just a high level view here. Here's a look at what those top 10 infographics look like. But truly the report, in looking at 2020 data, underscores how the variety of human and economic challenges that were brought on by the pandemic, the racial justice movements, and climate-related disasters impacted companies differently in some cases. However, in spite of all the pressures and that in uncertain context, the survey data really shows there's continued forward momentum around advancing ESG globally. So truly, in most cases, efforts accelerated rather than slowed down in 2020. This seems really to be largely motivated by both the heightening and deepening needs across global communities, as well as the growing expectations from both internal and external stakeholders, both employee expectations and public and investor expectations. So the large majority of companies who completed the survey indicated they've been responding to the current context with greater ESG issue management, investment, measurement, and reporting. On the next slide, I'll start diving into some of those specifics. I was smiling as the poll was taking place because the the results from the real-time poll reflect very similarly with what the respondents to the survey indicated. So we do know that efforts are accelerating to take a more holistic approach to managing ESG and integrating ESG more fully into business strategies. So the graphic here indicates that just 21% of companies felt that ESG would be integrated across departments within the next year, while another 54% of companies estimated 2 to 5 years. So altogether, 75% of companies, really a strong majority, predicted integration within the next 5 years. So as we've discussed, these growing stakeholders' expectations are driving some of these internal management considerations. And here we'll look at how those trends are showing up in ESG reporting as well. So it's really clear from the survey that the investor perspective continues to play a prominent role in ESG reporting. 74% of companies reported that they consider the investor perspective either sometimes or frequently. And as these stakeholder expectations grow and companies improve measurement capabilities, the amount of ESG data being reported also continues to grow. So 61% of companies shared that their amount of publicly released ESG data increased over the past year. On the next slide, I'll highlight how, even as companies respond to new requirements and reporting frameworks, they still continue to adopt the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which launched back in 2015. So our analysis of Bloomberg ESG data found that 26% of companies set a quantitative target for achieving at least one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And this represents an increase from 19% in 2019 and 14% in 2018. So overall, it seems clear that the Sustainable Development Goals framework continues to resonate and gain traction across corporations as they set targets and consider their long-term plans. On the next slide, I'm going to transition into topics included in the second half of the report, which focus more so on social investment trends. So beginning here with corporate giving. So also leveraging ESG data from Bloomberg, we looked at the median community spend of top global companies, and we saw just how dramatically the pandemic response drove community investment in 2020. So I'll note these figures do represent combined cash and in-kind donations, and product donations and supplies are very largely responsible for that 77% increase in the median community spend. That's particularly true for healthcare, where you see that median spend of 9.59 million, which is actually 3 times what it was the prior year. So massive response from that sector around those COVID-related needs. And looking at the median community spend as a percent of pre-tax profit, consumer staples leads here with 1.46%, which again is likely due to the number of product donations that companies provided to support relief efforts in that first year of the pandemic. So the kind of story here is, we know that some sectors experience significant hardship and hits to their revenue during the pandemic, but nonetheless, we see growth overall in how companies stepped up and responded during this time of just absolutely incredible need. Our next slide looks a little bit further into how companies responded to the pandemic. So 51% of the companies that we surveyed reported that their responses to COVID-19 led to new interventions. And then this slide just showcases of those new interventions, unsurprisingly, 65% of those were focused on healthcare. Turning now to employee programs, we took a look at volunteer participation, which incredibly dropped just 1% from 22% in the prior year. So it's really incredible to see this consistency when we consider the ways that the pandemic impacted NGOs' capacity to manage volunteers and to do so in ways that met social restrictions and safety concerns. But we also know that virtual volunteering programs gained traction in 2020. So that may be a factor that plays into, again, this kind of consistent level of engagement. The last section of the report is entitled Reframing Representation. So on this slide, we have an analysis of Bloomberg ESG data around workforce representation. So I've included a condensed view here of a 3-year trend insights, which show incremental gains in workforce and management representation for women and minorities, and really static performance for people with disabilities in the workforce. I'll just point to the fact that the report disaggregates each of these data sets by industry, and there's some really interesting trends visible there, but wanted at least to show again a quick snapshot here. On the next slide, we have a look at how companies who responded to the survey are investing in initiatives to further their DEI performance. So 70% of companies suggested that resources for DEI are on the rise. And I'll just close again by saying, you know, the report contains so much, some excellent country highlights and case studies. Definitely encourage you all to download and read it. There's a little QR code here that hopefully works. And I'll toss the link in the chat as well.
Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you for sharing that downloadable link. I do see that there are people asking about the presentation, access to the information. I said before, I think most of our delegates got onto the call, that we will make the recording of the session, the notes and the presentation available. We'll email it to you and we'll share it on our platforms after the session. Thanks again, Beth, and I look forward to getting into it in more detail when we get into the discussion part. But for now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Rohan Sharma. He's the Knowledge and Research Head of Samhita Social Ventures, which is based in India. Rohan, can I invite you to put on your camera and unmute yourself? And you may see that we had invited Priya to talk on behalf of Samhita, but Rohan very kindly stepped in at the last minute and was telling us a very interesting story just before we got in here about where he is at the moment. So before you get into ESG, can you just set the scene for us?
Thank you very much for having us on this panel. In fact, I want to start by acknowledging and appreciating the organizers for actually having a panel, because nowadays we only have manels, where women are hardly represented on the panel. So it feels wonderful to have so many women leaders on as my co-panelists. So thank you very much. I see that I'm the only male on this panel, and it's always lovely to see the world change like this, because I think we're all talking about change. Right. So before starting off, I think I'll just talk about a little bit of the conceptual framework. So today we're talking about ESG and social investment and global trends. But I look at ESG not as ESG, but as 2 ESG, right? And I'll tell you what I mean by that. For me, and this is, I think, a conceptual framework which will be very useful for all of us, because I also saw that we have a lot of nonprofits on board, and they are probably wondering, what do we get out of being a part of discourses on ESG? And I think it's wonderful to see that ESG has this kind of a demand among different stakeholders in the development sector. So this is not just something that is only for corporates. Largely, yes, it is a tool that helps corporates report on their non-financial performance better. But I think it's very, very important also for other stakeholders, like Zan, you rightly said. The civil society organizations are very, very important stakeholders as watchdogs, as ensuring there's public scrutiny, and I think therefore I'll try to make my talk a little bit so that it applies to all stakeholders who have joined here. So for me, the first E for ESG is ethics. I think ESG today, we are also talking about ESG as ethical investing. So I think this whole ethical approach to making profit is something which is like a paradigm shift. So far, we have always thought of profit as being this very dirty word, right? But I think today, increasingly, as we are talking about how complex development problems are, and we are increasingly realizing the interconnectedness that, say, a globalized world offers to us. We are increasingly realizing the importance of collaboration, convergence, right? And therefore, I think ethical investing is what ESG is. One. Second, for me, the E of the ESG refers to equity. A closely associated term with ESG is sustainability. Today, sustainability is a buzzword. Everybody's talking about, sustainability. We often use it loosely. We are also talking today about sustainable development goals. But, what do we really mean by sustainability? So therefore, for me, when we talk of equity, and I think this is an important value when we talk of either, have discussions on ESG or CSR, sustainability is nothing but intergenerational equity. Right, so we are basically saying that, and if any of you are interested, you can actually look at the definition of sustainable development that was given by the Brundtland Commission in 1987. That basically says that development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations. So there's always an intergenerational component. For me, the two S's refer to, one is social contract, right? When I talk of social contract, of course, some of you who have studied political science will know that, I'm not talking of Hobbes' social contract, but I'm basically talking about the whole license to operate. So basically, I think business today is realizing that, we need to operate and be neighbors of choice, right? Rather than, have hostile relations with our community. So I'll repeat that again. I think business is realizing that today community development or anything that we do vis-a-vis the S of the ESG is not for somebody else. It's not, out of our philanthropy or, the good desire or the desire that we have to, do good, but it is in our own interest. And I think that strategic element is very important for ESG to be successful. So the first is social contract and license to operate. The second S, I think, which is so critical to ESG discussions, is this whole supply chain management. So supply chain becomes very important. We're also talking about how do we have sustainable and resilient supply chains. And coming to the G, there are two G's for me when we talk of ESG. One is, of course, greater good. We often talk of this whole thing of what is good, and CSR initially in India, when we used to have the discussions, in fact, India has had a very, very long history. I mean, if you look at the whole cultural, religious tradition of India, and India is so diverse, you can't really, pinpoint, we have so many languages, so many, nuances, and therefore, when you're doing research also in the social sector, and, I'm a social scientist, I have been advocating that just a quantitative survey does not work, because, when you're working with vulnerable communities, you need to have more qualitative methods. You need to have more participatory methods, right? And this is something that I'll come to when we talk about how research is important to either ESG or CSR assessments. And the second G for me is greed, right? And when I talk about greed, I'm talking about this whole, I'd like to refer to a very, a book that I really like, is by Joel Bakan, his book called The Corporation, The Pathological Pursuit of Profit and Power. And in fact, he's just come up with a new book called The New Corporation, right? So much as, I don't think it is correct to, box any one entity as being good or bad, because, there are good and bad apples everywhere. I mean, you have great companies, you have, and I think it's important, therefore, ESG and everybody needs to join in the discussion to understand that it is not about individuals here. It's not about individuals, but it's more about institutions, and how do institutions actually come together on a common platform, and how do we, through empathy, and I think to do development work, the most important precondition is empathy. Coming back to today's discussion, and I think to the whole ESG debate, for me, there are three. The core of this entire discussion, or any discussion on CSR or ESG, is basically what is the role of business in society. I think once we get this clear, even for nonprofits, it becomes very easy, because often I've heard nonprofits, and like I said, I have been an academic. I have spent a lot of time on the ground, working very closely with nonprofits. I also advise a lot of senior corporate leaders. So I have had a good kind of a diverse experience of what are the needs. I think the basic problem, and while ESG is a step in the right direction, and I'll tell you, since we're talking about COVID-19, I think COVID-19 has, despite the devastating impact it has had, I think there are a lot of positives that have come out of it. One of them being, and if I were to talk about it, is that, it has actually shown us or brought to the fore an important concept called resilience, right? So it has tested the resilience of institutions. It has tested the resilience of values. It has tested the resilience of systems, right? And therefore, I think in India, this resilience of the corporate sector, of resilience of business, was really tested during the pandemic, right? In my opinion, the pandemic really exposed the myopic approach of several Indian businesses. We saw that with the COVID pandemic, this is something that has never happened, in the world of this kind of a scale or this kind of a, the sheer length at which this is, and it continues even today. But I think, we saw that many businesses were not able to even sustain their overheads for more than a fortnight. Their financial reserves were weak. There are so many images in India of the whole migrant labor crisis, right? And how businesses treated their various stakeholder groups like workers. So many employees were kind of terminated. So for me, the pandemic really, exposed the ESG vulnerabilities of many Indian businesses. And this leads me, therefore, to my next point, is that, many commentators, and I'm also of the view, is that India today is in a very, very interesting journey, right? So it's during the COVID pandemic that, today the government of India has really shown its commitment, and, that has been followed up by an excellent response from the corporate sector. Of course, there are different, like I said, we need to understand that there are different corporates at different points of their learning curve, right? When we talk of India today, we all of us entirely always think of the Tata Group. I mean, while the Tata Group has done excellent work, I think there are so many new companies. For example, I'll tell you the Reliance Industries, right? They have committed to becoming carbon neutral by 2035. Today, you have companies like, Airtel, Bharti Airtel, Infosys, I think Ashok Leyland, who today have a dedicated ESG committee. So I think there are companies in India today who are actually realizing, and the reason I gave the whole backdrop of COVID is, had COVID not happened, I think the resilience of systems, the resilience of business would not have been tested, and therefore, this kind of an overwhelming kind of a buy-in by corporate India towards ESG and this whole shift to beyond CSR, as I call it. In fact, I talk about it, 3-lane highway. So honestly, I think CSR is something that, and one of the reasons why I think ESG came to the fore, and I'll take you through the Indian experience, because I was part of some of the initial discussions when CSR was really being born in India. I was very fortunate to work closely with the policymakers at that time. I think CSR always moved or remained at responsibility. I think where ESG moves, therefore, is actually beyond this responsibility, and it moves into two domains. One domain is the whole corporate social opportunity. And I think this is something that I said that, we need, and today companies are realizing that this corporate philanthropy, or me wanting to do something in a very myopic vision, or just give a one-time donation, or just, do a few health camps, does not work, because today communities have been empowered. There are rights-based legislations in India, several of them, which today have made people very empowered. Therefore, today communities are not. It's not a kind of a passive recipient of grant or aid, right? And I think this is where CSR needs to really rise to the occasion. I think that's where corporates today, and again, COVID has I think given that opportunity, where corporates today realize that we need to be truly corporate citizens, right? We truly need to be environmental stewards, right? We really need to be demonstrators of purposeful brands, right? Therefore, so again, I was talking about a little bit about this whole ESG crisis. If I were to kind of speak, okay, do I have to wrap up, Zan? How much time do I have?
I mean, I would give you the rest of the session because you've touched on incredibly poignant points that I think resonates with our audience as well. Thank you for bringing issues of equity that takes intergenerational issues into account, empathy into the conversation earlier on. Then I thought, thank you for sharing that. Let's discuss more. I do want to at this point hand over to Kathy Duff, just for some of her opening remarks, and then we can move on to the discussion. Just a reminder before I hand over to Kathy, that you can please pop your questions into the Q&A box rather than the chat box. I do see questions in there that I will definitely pick up, but if you've got questions, please do move them over to the Q&A box so we don't miss them. And Kathy is our last panelist for this afternoon. She's a director at Trialogue. Kathy, we've had the global perspective. We've had really interesting, fascinating insight from India. Are you able to bring it home for us and tell us how South African social investment and ESG practices compare to the global results and trends of the Global Impact at Scale report? And based on these current global trends, how you think that this will change over time and what it means for CSI?
Thanks, Dee. I'll definitely try and do that. And I'll also try shorten what I was going to say a little bit because Rohan, that was fascinating, your input. And I see that there were already questions popping up into the chat. So I do want to leave some time for questions. I'm just going to try pull out from what both of our great panelists have said today, just 5 out of many other trends that have picked up in the research and also what Rohan was talking about, what's happening in India. And just try to touch on what this means for companies and nonprofits in South Africa. So the first, and I think Beth spoke to this, Rohan spoke to this, is that ESG has been increasingly integrated into strategy. Now, this was reflected in the global findings, and in our research in South Africa, we found that 67% of companies reported that their overall business strategy very much integrates ESG issues. So we're seeing the same trend happening here. But what does this mean for CSI practitioners on the call and for the nonprofits on the call? I think importantly, it means more aligned and strategic social investment. So we've seen this shift happening over years, and we expect it to accelerate and further, where businesses are providing their resources, their competencies, their products, their services, and really aligning their social investment to the core business. I think this will result in more non-cash giving. So we'll still obviously have the cash giving, but there'll be greater non-cash giving. And it'll also result in more focused CSI with larger and longer term programs. So while this, I think one of the concerns that a lot of nonprofits have is that this will most likely benefit some sectors more than others. So those sectors, development sectors that are more aligned to business will benefit from this trend. And I think particularly education and enterprise development. And we certainly see that in South Africa. I think the takeout for nonprofits is really that nonprofits need to consider alignment to the business whenever they're looking at corporate partnerships. So they need to consider what skills they need, what resources, what services, what products, and form partnerships based on that rather than just a kind of financial ask. They may also have fewer corporate partners going forward, but we expect that the support will be more significant and longer term. Okay, I'm going to move quickly on to the next one, which is around ESG reporting. Beth spoke to this about increased transparency and reporting. We've certainly seen that as a trend, and I think on the positive side, we've seen that there's been many different codes and standards and indicators, but there is convergence. And in November last year, the International Sustainability Standards Board was formed in order to try and create a global standard around this. So again, what does it mean for companies and then nonprofits here in South Africa? I think firstly, disclosure around standardized metrics is going to be expected. There's going to be a move towards impact metrics rather than just looking at inputs or risks to investments. And so there's going to be a requirement for social investment practitioners as well as nonprofits to measure and report on impact. We've already seen that happening over the years, but we expect this to accelerate. And in many cases, this reporting will be linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, which Beth mentioned, and their specific targets and indicators. I think Beth and Rohan touched on this, that social investment is expected to increase. Some of this was driven by COVID. So we saw in the global results that there was an increase in the last year. In South Africa, actually, we found that there was a decrease in social investments over the past year as companies' profitability was hit. But when we asked corporates in South Africa what they expect to happen to social investment, they expect it to increase in the coming years. So again, the takeout is really that we do see social investment remaining an important issue, becoming more important for businesses, and that companies will be able to plan and support more longer term and larger flagship programs in line with that first trend around integration and alignment to the business. The next thing which Beth touched on, and I just want to come back to, is employee engagement. We've certainly seen an increase in employee engagement programs in South Africa. Most companies now have some kind of program. And yet, when we look at the global findings, South Africa companies still lag slightly. So just an example, more than 70% of the global companies offer match funding for personal donations, and around a third of workforces participate. In South Africa, it's around 50% of our large companies that offer that, and a much smaller participation rate of around 15%. Similarly, globally, the median for days off for volunteering is 2 days, and here in South Africa, it's 1 day. So takeouts for companies here are really that employees want to work for companies that match their values and that offer engagement opportunities. So volunteering programs are going to have to become more sophisticated, offering more options for employees and also more aligned to the business. Companies are going to have to invest more in volunteering, including in measuring and monitoring the volunteering, as I mentioned when I spoke to the metrics and reporting. So for nonprofits, the kind of takeout is that nonprofits need to consider what skills they need across the business or that they could use to support their work, and to develop structured volunteering opportunities to take to corporate partners, as this is really becoming a must-have for large businesses. And then lastly, and as I mentioned, there are a lot more trends, but I just want to pick out the last one, that climate is becoming a priority. Everyone's obviously aware of COP26 and all the movement that's happening, particularly around companies committing to net zero targets. We have seen a number of companies in South Africa do that, but we expect that to accelerate again, and companies are going to have to put strategies and plans in place to reach that net zero. And those are not just going to be about mitigation and avoiding emissions, but also they're going to be about adaptation and building resilience in the company as well as its supply chain and community. So again, what does that mean for social investment practitioners and nonprofits? I think that all programs are going to need to consider and be able to articulate what impact they're having on environment and how they contribute towards these net zero goals. In our survey last year, we did ask companies if they consider environment and how they consider it in their social investment. And we found that 18% of companies said they have specific projects focused on environment. Most of the rest of them included as a consideration or a cross-cutting theme. But a quarter of the companies we surveyed said they don't consider environment at all in their social investment. So we see that shifting in the coming year as this becomes a global priority. Okay, I'm going to stop there so that we can have some time for Q&A.
Thanks very much, Kathy. I'm now going to invite our other panelists, Rohan and Beth, to turn their cameras on. I do have a question for each of you. We don't have much time. So Rohan, I'm going to start with a question for you from Marie Paramangani. She asks if you think that the current approaches and metrics for ESG are sufficient to shift the culture, mindset, and purpose of business to make sure that they add real social value.
Right. I think to answer that, again, I'll go back to the fundamental question, I think, which is what is the role of business in society? And I think to go back, and this becomes for me the core of the entire discussion on CSR and ESG, and especially my request to nonprofits is that once we have clarity on this, what is really the role of the state, I mean the government, the role of industry, and role of civil society, then things become very clear. As far as I'm concerned, talking of value, I'll just try to answer your question by talking about how thought has
Okay, I think let's move on. Kathy, there is a question for you as well. We're going to have to, Oh no, is right in the chat box. But just in the interest of time, let's move on to Kathy and come back to Rohan. Kathy, Margaret Rustov asks about BBEE. She says it has an unfortunate reputation. And she asks, how do we change the South African mindset to the partnerships between business and nonprofits? So in many cases, partnerships are positive and outputs are really meaningful. How do we accelerate this?
Thanks, Zehan, and thanks, Margaret, for the question. And I think you're right. We have seen that in some instances, you know, BBEE has created a kind of tick box approach or an input approach where companies are measuring how much they give because that's what the target is about, but not really looking at the longer term partnership and benefit. I think one of the things that's helped us to accelerate that is the COVID pandemic itself. And I think Rohan spoke to this in that it elevated the importance of social investment and the S in companies. And it really, where leadership wasn't brought in before, I think in many cases, the pandemic accelerated that. And I think if you look at all the trends that we've spoken about today, I see that continuing. So if those partnerships, and there are great, like you said, there's great examples of corporate nonprofit partnerships that are producing real value. If those can, if the outputs and outcomes of those can be measured and the business leadership can understand the value that those bring to the company as well as to society, I think we're going to see an acceleration of that integration, as I said, and of more meaningful partnerships. So the longer term, the real partnership beyond just financial grants. Thanks, I see we have Rohan back.
Thanks very much, Kathy. And Rohan, over to you. Do you want me to reframe the question or would you like to pick up where you?
Yes, please. My apologies. I missed out on bad network. Please, if you could read. Yeah.
Absolutely. So thank you for coming back. The question is around whether you think that the current approaches and metrics for ESG are sufficient to shift the culture, mindset, and the purpose of business to make sure that they add real social value.
Yeah, so, you know, I think the ESG frameworks are definitely sufficient because, you know, like I said, the gaps of CSR, I think, have been addressed in the ESG. So for me, this whole corporate social responsibility, and, you know, India is actually the first country in the world that has mandated CSR by law, which is, you know, great. And India is also the first country in the world that is going to mandate ESG reporting from, April 1st, 2022. So I think India is clearly committed to, you know, being a leader when it comes to ESG. And you also had a very good, like I was saying, because of COVID, you know, big businesses understand why ESG is important for them to sustain as a business. Forget about, you know, wanting to do just good. So I think that message is coming. To answer, you know, the question, I think, again, we need to go back to the basic question for me, which is, you know, the whole role of business in society. This is something that Nobel laureate, you know, Milton Friedman spoke about in 1970 in his New York Times article, where he said the business of business is business, right? Having said that, while a lot of people think that, you know, Milton Friedman was this neoliberal economist, you know, I think what he said is something that I started off by saying. He said that for a business to be really recognized as a business, it must be ethical at all times, right? I think that was an important, and that's where, again, ESG draws from. So, you know, I think when talking of ESG, and we must remember the greats, and for me, Milton Friedman was a great, you know, who actually started the ball rolling. We must also, you know, and this is something that when we were making the policy in India, we also referred to the work of, you know, one of the global authorities on corporate responsibility, which is, you know, John Elkington, you know, where he spoke about this whole triple bottom line: people, planet, profit. I think ESG is actually drawing from the work. Just to kind of give you know, to answer that question a little bit more, like I said, you know, you spoke about values. So for me, I think there are, again, since it's a trialogue, I'll keep it to 3. So one is ethical, which I spoke about Milton Friedman. The second is values. And I think what we are basically trying, what the corporate sector is trying to do through either CSR or ESG, is to create shared prosperity through shared values, right? So I think it is increasingly, and given this whole interconnectedness, and I'm trying to link this to what I started by saying that, you know, I think globalization today has put a lot of foreign investors today are watching very closely, right? And I think that kind of a push that is coming on local businesses is a step in the right direction, because today, you know, people are saying that, you know, and I think, for example, this in the social part of it, you know, how inclusive are your boards? I mean, do you have PWDs on your board? Do you have minorities on your board? It doesn't matter, So I think this is basically what corporate citizenship is about. And this is where, and today I think, we all know how powerful the corporate sector is, but often they have not risen to the occasion. And I think today with governments, right? I mean, looking at corporate sector across the world, in every country, the corporate sector has so much of power and influence. I think it's time that, they are today, rather than being pushed, of course, there has been a strong degree of voluntarism, but drawing from the Indian experience, I think voluntarism doesn't work, right? So, and that's where the government has to take, a regulator has to take the step. And talking of regulation, in India, you have the Securities and Exchange Board of India, which actually has made BRSR mandatory, which is the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Reporting template, right? So today, while, and I think, Kathy, you're talking of the whole COP26. So I think while at COP26, we spoke about the whole universal sustainability standards, which is still being deliberated, so that to have an international framework that, all countries can, in a way, adhere to, and that allows for comparison. But I think India has led the way, and I'm so proud of that, today we have the BRSR tool, which is a valuable tool for Indian business to communicate their ESG commitments. And the last one, sorry, Zan, is investment. We spoke of investment. Samhita has actually developed this tool, and I'm very happy to share this with all of you, called the Multidimensional Community Empowerment Index, right? Where, for all our nonprofit friends from all over who have joined us, we are actually saying, just like you have ESG, a tool for the business side of things, just like you have the SROI, social return on investment tool, that tells the business how well you are doing. Today, to understand how have your community initiatives really empowered communities, Samhita has come up with this multi-dimensional community empowerment index, which I think is the first. And we're very happy to kind of collaborate with all of you, whether you're nonprofits, whether you're a researcher, as we roll this out in India. So yeah, I hope I answered that question.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Rohan, and also for sharing the multidimensional index with us. We'll look into that from Trialogue's perspective, certainly. Beth, I want to take this opportunity. I think India is a fascinating case study because there are so many parallels between our struggles with issues of inequity linked to intergenerational issues. And so I think we've heard from that from the Indian perspective. From the US perspective, I think what's resonating with us in South Africa quite, it's kind of reverberating at the moment, is addressing issues of systemic racism and the way your country's responded to that. And bringing it down to the business level, I want to ask you about how companies are and how they should be responding to the growing global call for greater racial and gender equity. And I wonder if you have examples of corporate leaders on these issues.
Yeah, I think what we saw, again, the pandemic, and then in the US, the killing of George Floyd, those kind of concurrent things just really shone a spotlight on inequity, and really, in many cases, we were dancing around issues of systemic racism, and really brought that out into the forefront. And corporate leaders really realized they needed to kind of humble themselves and lean in and listen and respond to these issues in a different way. So I think what we've seen in the corporate sphere is rather than diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts kind of being managed through a diversity leader or team within HR, it really became everyone's job in an authentic and fundamental way. So everyone, I've seen across the business, from this C-suite through the actual business functions. So that's I think been heartening to see. We saw on the slide I presented earlier, 70% of companies globally are investing. So I think in the coming years, so investing resources in DEI means staffing programs. So I think in the coming years, we'll be watching to see what's coming out of those investments and resourcing. And just a few examples of, I think, companies that are doing it well. I'll just point to Target, a retailer in the US. They've done an incredible job of just tracking and disclosing in a public way. They have 53% women in the workforce and 50% in management, and really incredible numbers on people of color in employment. So I think companies are leaning into, we need to track things in order to manage them, measure to manage, and then are making real commitments and then resourcing things in order to create the sorts of impact that they're looking for.
Absolutely. I want to echo the measure to manage, lean in and listen. Lovely points. Thank you. To round up the session, we've got just about 5 minutes. I want to go once around the call and ask each of the panelists. I think in this session, we are to a large extent preaching to the converted. I think people who sign up to this get it and don't need to be convinced. But in order to kind of fill our toolbox, help fill our toolbox, I wonder if you can comment on the role of leadership in driving ESG. And I want to ask you about what advice you would give to delegates on the call today whose organizational leaders may not yet be championing ESG. Rohan, can I start with you?
Yeah, sure. But I just, before answering that quickly, to take on from what Beth said, she mentioned about, female participation in the workforce. And I think this is a serious problem in coming out from India. India actually has the lowest level of female participation in the workforce, about 22.2%. And this is as opposed to the whole global average of 48.5%. And this is something that was a problem. I mean, and given that Samhita, is leading a lot of global alliances, Revive Alliance is one of them, where we are working with Omidya Network India, UNDP, UK government, USAID, etc. We then realized that, how do we get corporates on board? Because this is a real problem out there. And a lot of women we found had to, and women workers were far more impacted by the pandemic, right? So therefore, we then, and I think this is a model that we are very open to exploring with South Africa and with US, our other friends and colleagues here. Therefore, we actually came up with the Women at Work Alliance, Revive Alliance. And I think we came up with this very interesting financial instrument called the returnable grant model. Today we don't have the time, but happy to speak about this at a later time. This has been really hailed by USAID as one of the biggest kind of alliances to have come out of India, and I'm happy to have that. But to answer your question, I think my request or how can ESG, how can corporates embrace an ESG agenda, if that's what you ask me? I have a 10-point agenda, sorry, but I'll just briefly go through them quickly. One is, I think corporates have to embrace and accept a better normal. And that's why we at Samhita call it a better normal, right? And where, sorry, okay. Can I go on?
Sorry, that was my clapping on mute.
Oh, sorry. So one is, I think corporates need to accept the new reality that, time is running out. Climate change is here, global warming is here to stay. And if corporates don't become environment stewards, it's going to be too late, right? And I think, like I said, corporates have a lot of power influence. That's one. Second, I think creating a governance focus where today, companies, I gave you a name of a few from India who have started having dedicated ESG committees, right? Even today, India has been the first country in the world to have made CSR a mandate by law. By law, companies are required to have a CSR board level committee. So India is taking CSR and ESG very, very seriously, right? Third, I think, is supply chains. We spoke about that. And I think instead of talking of CSR, we need to talk of RSC. We just need to invert it, where RSC talks of resilient supply chains. Fourth is, I think we need to make more investments in innovation and strategic partnerships and research. I think one of the panelists already spoke about it. When we're talking of innovative products, like I told you from India, Samhita has come up with the whole returnable grant, which is an innovative finance model. We're coming up with the multidimensional community empowerment index. We're doing a lot of focus on participatory learning and action when we do assessments for corporate sector in India, right? Earlier, like I said, focus was more on, we want to do this assessment, who cares about the community? But today, increasingly, Samhita is being able to work with corporates, telling them, you need to look at them not as research objects, but as research participants, right? So that's the third. Diversity and inclusion workplaces is very important. And I think companies need to move, and I'll end with this. I know, Zain, I'm taking a little more time, but I'll end with this. For me, corporates need to move from adopting communities more to become service providers as they move to become neighbors of choice. And I'll end with this. And then to do that, all that a corporate has to do for communities is not to empower individuals one by one, but just to facilitate and create an ecosystem where the ecosystem expands capabilities and capacities of people where people can empower themselves. So I think that's very important for corporates. And this is, I think, a very pragmatic approach. And this is actually drawing from the whole human development paradigm that Dr. Amartya Sen and the others speak about. So again, I'll end with the basic. We need to be very clear what is the role of business in society. And the debate is essentially between economic growth or human development. I'll end with that. Thank you very much.
Rohan, thank you very much. And I want to suggest that we add all tenure points into our summary notes so that we don't lose out in any of those insights. But thank you for that. Beth, can I hand over to you to ask you for advice on how to get corporate leadership buy-in as we move ESG forward?
I think this is, I will just give an easy and succinct answer, like employee engagement. Employees are stakeholder number one right now. And if leadership doesn't understand that creating, demonstrating to colleagues that they are leading with purpose and they are behaving in ethical ways, they'll fail to attract, retain, and engage the talent that they need to meet the needs of today. So I think that's the call to action for leaders right now.
Thank you so much, Beth. Kathy, your last parting advice.
Thanks. Yes, I think there's few leaders out there who aren't aware of these issues now. And so, if it's a matter of convincing recalcitrant directors and leaders, then I think there are so many different forces, and maybe it's more constant awareness for those leaders around the regulations that are coming down the line, which are going to impact the bottom line, no doubt. If companies aren't meeting the EU green taxonomy, they're not going to get investment, there's going to be trade barriers, etc. So there's very economic arguments that can be made. There's regulation, there's the employees, as Beth said, there's communities. I love that phrase, neighbors of choice. And so I think it's a matter of really keeping at it and raising that awareness. And I think as this further pressure from stakeholders and regulation comes down the line, there's just going to be no more avoiding it. Thanks, Zee.
Thanks so much. Thanks to all of you for your fantastic insight. Tabby, we hear you and we agree. We need to relook the time on these sessions. Your point is noted. I want to thank you all again for your time, to the delegates for being here, to the panelists for your fantastic insight, to the team for the organization of this event. We are going to pop the feedback survey onto your screen as you leave the call, and we'll also email you the notes, the presentation, the recording, and the survey. Thank you all very much. Have a lovely rest of your days, depending where you are in the world. And until next month, bye-bye.